Our nation upholds the idea of constitutional supremacy, with the Federal Constitution of Malaysia serving as the supreme law of the land. According to Article 4, Clause 1, any law that is inconsistent with the Federal Constitution may be challenged in court and will be void to the extent of inconsistency. Hence, an individual may justify and validate his or her actions based on the Constitution by employing established principles and legal precedents to interpret and uphold the constitutional provisions that govern the specific issue at hand.
However, if a person does challenge the validity of a provision that requires a judge to interpret the Constitution, then certain approaches must be taken. These approaches are known as constitutional interpretation, a process that involves analyzing and understanding the text, principles, and objectives of the Constitution. In order to understand how these approaches work, let's take a look at the case of Siva Rasa Rahsia against Jabatan Pugam Negara.
Siva Rasa Rahsia, the appellant who was an advocate and solicitor as well as an office bearer of a political party and a member of parliament, wished to be elected as a roll member of the Bar Council, the governing body of the Malaysian Bar.
Why can I join the Bar Council? It's my right.
Calm down, sir. I'm very sorry, but you're not allowed to do so because you are a member of a political party.
Nonsense. This is not fair. I'm bringing this to the court. But wait a minute. I don't think that he can become a bar council. Don't you think so?
No, he can. This is because, according to Section 46A, subsection 1, paragraph C, subparagraph 2 of the Legal Profession Act 1976, a person shall be disqualified for being a member of the Bar Council or a Bar Committee or of any committee of the Bar Council if he hold any office in any political party.
Oh, I see. No wonder.
Yes, but come to think of it, why he still want to challenge the constitutionality of that provision?
If not mistaken, there are three grounds that the appellant wish to argue. Firstly, he believed that it violated Article 8, Clause 1 of the Federal Constitution, which is regarding the protection of law, equality, protection of law. Secondly, he also argued that it violates Article 10, Clause 1C, which is regarding freedom of association. And last but not least, it also sort of argued on the grounds of personal liberty under Article 5, Article 5, Clause 1. Yes. So I think that's about it.
No, I know about it.
Okay. Your Honor.
I do think Bar Council is infringing my rights by not allowing me to join them.
I do not think that's the case, young man. As stated in Section 46A, subsection 1 of the Legal Profession Act 1976, a person shall be disqualified from being a member of the Bar Council if he holds any office in any political party.
But why is that so, Your Honor?
Of course, there is an important reason for policy in support of the classification made.
But, Your Honor, I have rights to Article 10, Clause 1, Paragraph C, 8, Clause 1, and 5, Clause 1 of the Constitution.
I'm afraid not, young man. This is because Section 46A is compliant with the Equality Clause of Article 8, Clause 1. It is therefore a fair and just law within Article 5, Clause 1. Hence, it does not offend the article.
But, Your Honor,
Based on the analysis of the case, it becomes evident that the process of arriving at legal decisions by a judge necessitates a comprehensive interpretation of the Constitution. To reach informed conclusions, judges are required to delve deeply into the intricacy of the challenge provision, employing a diverse approaches for a nuanced understanding. According to His Lordship Gopal Sri Ram, the first has to do with the methodology of interpretation of the guaranteed rights. In particular, the fundamental liberties guaranteed under Part 2 must be generously interpreted, and that a prismatic approach to interpretation must be adopted. The word prismatic here literally means all angles. This means that constitutional provisions can be understood or interpreted from multiple perspectives. Therefore, we have identified two approaches used by the Federal Court judge in order to make his judgment in accordance with the constitutional interpretation. Let us discuss on the approaches used by the Federal Court Judge Gopal Sri Raj in interpreting the constitutionality of the Section 46A of the Legal Profession Act. Based on the case itself, what are your findings? Like, if you could tell me to the members of the round table, what are your findings regarding this case?
So, the first approach that we were able to analyze from the case is the literal approach.
It is mainly about finding the meaning and intention of the legislature that have been expressed effectively by actual word used in this act.
Could you perhaps explain what is literal approach is about?
From my understanding, it means that the judges do not have to look to materials intrinsic to the statute to guide them in their interpretation.
But instead, they determine the statute meaning on the basis of their statutory words themselves.
If the words of the statutes are themselves precise and ambiguous, then no more can be necessary than to expound those words in their natural and ordinary senses. So, actually, the words alone do the best to declare the lawgiver intention.
So, for the literal approach, are there any guidelines that the judges need to follow when using this approach?
Certainly. Firstly, the court shall work on the assumption that Parliament knows what it means to achieve and what the legislature intended by the law that has been made perfectly. The judges of the court then are not required to put on a gloss on the words or seek to otherwise make sense of the statute. This approach works as a strict interpretation of the statute, and the court only needs to give effect of the word by the judge's judgment based on what is provided in the word of the statute.
But how does this approach relate with the case of Siva Rasa Rahsia?
In the Siva Rasa Rahsia against Badan Peguam Malaysia and another, dispute revolved around fundamental liberties, particularly Article 5 and 8 and also Article 10 of the Federal Constitution. So in Part 2 of this Federal Constitution, employing a literal approach, the court has assumed that the clarity in the Constitution have a basic fabric. On the other hand, the court also maintains that the construction of the fundamental liberties in the Federal Constitution itself, especially in Part 2, is unambiguously clear. So this led to the conclusion that the right and liberties in this Part 2 of the Federal Constitution are not only guaranteed but also enforceable. So in the essence, the court stance established that the constitutional safeguards in Part 2 are both integral and enforceable within the judicial system. So these legal precedents marks a significant milestone in shaping the interpretative landscape of fundamental under the Federal Constitution.
Oh, since you mentioned the provisions, could you perhaps shed light on the article and how does the literal approach play a part in it?
The court used a literal approach to interpret the argument. Section 46A Clause 1 of the Legal Profession Act 1976 violates personal liberty guaranteed in Article 5 Clause 1 of the Federal Constitution. So it concludes that these articles safeguard freedoms embedded in the terms life and the terms personal liberty. So by that, the court already interprets that the court has construed this freedom based on the literal expressions in Article 5 Clause 1.
From a different standpoint, the court interprets the phrase in accordance with law in somewhat negative light, suggesting that Section 46A of the Legal Profession Act 1976 does not violate the appellant's right to be the member of the Malaysian Bar. Instead, it restricts them from serving in distinct body. Inclusion of this word is mandated by the Act and relevant subsidiary legislation in the section.
If I'm not mistaken, the case also mentioned Article 8, right?
Yes! For this article, the test of constitutionality is only based on substantive fairness. The interpretation of these articles must be treated as separate and instinct right despite an overlap in the judgment. Equal before the law is interpreted referring to Dicey rule of law which derive from the doctrine of equality. While the equality protection of the law already mentioned that it vested protections that the law has been enacted without the influence. So for the section 46A, it's literally clear that these provisions had no political leaning, which means it's equal.
On the final note, by section 8, the court has interpreted by coming out 3 intention. This section has been legislated, which has been expressed effectively by the actual word used in this section. The first intention is to keep the Bar Council free from political influence. The second intention is for the public interest to have governing body, namely the Bar Council. The third intention is to proportionate the object it seeks to achieve.
However, there are also other types of interpretation that can be found in this case. Is it possible for you to tell us about your findings in terms of interpretation that you were able to analyze from this case?
Yes, of course. Another approach that was used is purposive approach. This approach actually is a hybrid of the literal approach, or it has evolved from the literal approach. This can be seen in the word of Lord Denning, where he said that judges ought not to go by the letter of the statute. They ought to go by the spirit of it. Furthermore, in the case of Pepper against Hart 1993, the days have long passed when the courts adopted a strict constructionist view of interpretation, which required them to adopt a literal meaning of the language. As now, they adopt a purposive approach which seeks to give effect to the purpose of legislation and are prepared to look at much extraneous for the judges of the court to find the true intention of why the legislatures are made or amended in the laws of the first place.
Interesting! Can you perhaps explain more about this approach?
Basically, this approach is about finding the legal meaning in a legal text as well as the classifications of its meaning when some phrases bring about more than one meaning, which sets the limits of the interpretation. The purpose of a constitution on being made can be traced from committee reports, bills of parliament, and floor debates. In relation to that, the purposive approach is being applied only when the words used are unclear and ambiguously. Otherwise, the literal approach will be used.
That is true. This approach also investigates the meaning of the text by searching the purpose and intention of the legislatures enacting the law. It is pivotal to take note that this approach overlaps with certain approaches such as originalism, argument based on moral value, and literal approach itself, as this approach governs the whole intention as to why these provisions are made.
How does the court establish purposes approach in this case?
Well, you can see how it interprets the section in the case of Siva Rasa Rahsia against Badan Peguam Malaysia. Purposive approach is one of the methods of the constitutional interpretation that are being used, in which it is stated that the purpose of the Section 46A of the Legal Profession Act, which disqualifies anyone who holds position in a political party from being a member of the Bar Council. It was to ensure that the Bar Council is free from political influence and subsequently prevent any potential conflict of interest situation.
In regards to the challenge presented by the appellant on the contradiction of Section 46A of Legal Profession Act 1976 with Article 10 Clause 1C that touches on freedom of association, the first guideline that was established by the judges was to see whether a statutory body like the Malaysian Bar is an association within Article 10 Clause 1C. The concept of freedom of association includes within the right not only to be a member but also serve on the Bar Council, the governing body of the Malaysian Bar. And in addition to that, this guideline was later confirmed that Malaysian Bar is indeed an association as it was made under a statute and has from its inception been governed by statute, namely the Act and the subsidiary legislation made thereunder, in which they also refer to the case of Daman Singh, State of Punjab Air, where therefore Article 10 Clause 1C does not apply to the Malaysian Bar and it does not violate the appellant's freedom of association. Subsequently, challenge of the violation of his freedom of association as a member of the Bar Council is also invalid.
The second guideline is to see whether disqualification of the member of the Bar Council constitute under Section 46A is reasonable restriction under the Article 10 Clause 2 Paragraph C. This guideline is made in accordance with the presumption of that what if the case of Daman Singh was wrongly decided and the Malaysian Bar is an association, and even if the appellant has the fundamental rights to serve on the Bar Council. In this guideline, it is proven that the restrictions are reasonable and justifiable on the grounds of the public morality. In other words, it is morally right to restrict a guaranteed freedom of association for a Bar Council member from being a member of a political party to ensure that they behave professionally, act honestly, and independent of any political influence. Therefore, this is how the purpose approach works in the case in order to interpret the constitutionality of it.
Great points, Ephraim and Isaac. So, I believe that at the end of the day, from this case, we are able to understand that although the court has set a certain way to interpret the constitution, it is still up to the councils to exercise their power by deciding on how to interpret it.
And no council would actually follow the actual way of the interpretation as it is sometimes is too rigid. So instead, there are options for them to pick and choose what they think it is suitable to be applied in the judgment that they are trying to make.
In theory, Executing the approaches in the exact form that it was held to be will seem sort of easy, but in reality, the practicality of it is questionable. The overlapping between approaches can actually be visible in the end.
And if you look at this closely, it is actually what the authority believes. It is not something that we can simply have to abide by the book and find all the answers without looking at it deeply. It actually depends on how the council interpret and argue it.
But we can be sure and keep in our mind that despite many ways of interpreting the constitution, the interpretation will always be ensured to be as just as possible, making the deliverance of justice is done accordingly.